So welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlotte. I'm Ward Simmons. I'm one of 6 Dharma leaders that rotate responsibility for leading. It's nice to see such a large crowd tonight, and welcome to all of those of you on Zoom. If I counted right, we've got 34 in the room and 19 on Zoom, so that's a good crowd. So I really love the Dharma and insight meditation practice. It has literally, it sounds like a cliche, but it has been life-changing for me. And the longer I follow this path, the more I discover the value of it. And I'm imagining that my experiences are not so different from many of you here in the room and on Zoom with us tonight. So over the years and the decades that I've been practicing, I've also found myself confronted with any number of unfamiliar and confusing situations. So I was raised as a Lutheran, and early on I realized that that was not a path that spoke to me. And I was young, and we know a whole lot when we're young, and I bristled at the idea that I was supposed to follow the teachings of some long dead spiritual leader, that is Jesus, as documented in these ancient texts of questionable reliability, that is the Bible. How could anybody expect me to so easily surrender my own judgment? So how have I ended up being so devoted to the teachings of a long dead spiritual teacher, the Buddha, as documented in ancient texts of questionable reliability, which is the Pali Canon? For me, one thing that really appeals to me about the Dharma is the emphasis that's placed on our own individual knowing. The Buddha repeatedly used the Pali term eopassiko, and usually that's translated into English as come and see for yourself. And this is sometimes misunderstood to mean that everybody's views are equally valid and there's no need for direction or study or research, but really nothing could be further from the truth. The Buddha encouraged his followers to listen to and respect elders, experienced practitioners, and to take direction from them. But in the end, after all of our diligent effort, it's ultimately up to each of us to determine what we are going to find to be true. And this really shows a great deal of trust, a great confidence in each individual's capacity for discernment. Most spiritual traditions don't allow this kind of latitude, and they don't exhibit this kind of confidence in the followers. It would really be a lot easier if there were just a book of answers. If we didn't have to do all this discernment stuff, we could just look things up and know what the answer was. But the path we have chosen is not an easy path. We didn't choose the easy path. Along with this latitude comes the burden of responsibility. So it's a lot of work to discern the correct path forward when we're dealing with complex ethical issues. But that is the path of the Dharma. This evening, I'll be talking about a few of the conflicts that I have encountered on this path and how I've reconciled them. And maybe some of you have bumped into the same issues. So the first challenge, when we try to look at the Buddha's words and actions for guidance, is where do we look? So the Pali Canon is a collection of ancient writings or suttas that are primarily attributed to the Buddha, and this is widely recognized as the most reliable source. But like most ancient texts, it's imperfect. The first several hundred years after the Buddha's death, the written word was not widely used. And during this time, the teachings of the Buddha were handed down orally. So the nuns and the monks preserving this record, they took great care to do it accurately, but it'd be unrealistic to think that there were no errors that occurred. So I saw a cartoon the other day, and it was a picture of Jesus and four of his disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I don't know so much about the Bible, but those are the four authors of the four Gospels. And Jesus is speaking to them, and he's saying, now pay attention. I don't want four different versions of this. And no, we've got different versions of the Dharma. So once we get past that hurdle, and finally they're recorded in writing, then they had to survive this human inclination to improve upon what's been recorded. So there's a risk that somebody believed they could clarify by changing certain words or phrases. It's honorable intention. Or there's the risk somebody believed they could clarify by elaborating on a teaching. Or there's the risk that somebody believed that there was a point that wasn't addressed that needed to be addressed, and so amplified. Given that the Buddha's teachings were 2,600 years ago, it's again unrealistic to think this hasn't survived without somebody improving upon them. So even if the historical record hadn't been subject to errors or improvements, there's the issue of translation. The Pali Canon was translated from the Pali language into many different languages. And often there are not words in one language that precisely translate from another language. And so you get incomplete translations. And sometimes different translators choose different translations for the same word. And finally, there are different traditions that emphasize different parts of the Buddhist teachings. So insight meditation finds its home in the Theravadan tradition, and that term is usually translated as doctrine of the elders because it considers the Pali Canon to be primary. And as I said, that's generally agreed to be the earliest surviving record of the Buddhist teachings. But if you have a conversation with another on a Dharma topic with a Zen practitioner or a Tibetan practitioner, you might discover that you have very different understandings. So now that I have completely undercut your confidence in the historical record, why do we even bother to refer to it? The short answer is it's the best that we have. A little more encouraging answer is that there are ways for scholars to determine some degree of historical accuracy. And just like we see in Christianity here in America, there are fundamentalists who adhere strictly to the word of the document, and then the more progressive people who look at the spirit, and all kinds of people in between. It's the same with the Buddhist teaching. And that's one of the reasons that discernment is so needed in this practice. So there's one particular development that has probably clouded the historical record as much as anything, and that is the Buddhist religion. Now, let me be quick to say that I am sharing my own personal view here, and other teachers probably would disagree with me. Everybody's got an understanding of that. But the Buddha didn't set out to found a religion. His intention was to share what he learned about how the mind works and how we can live in this world in a way that creates less suffering for ourselves and others. And after his death, some of his very devoted and accomplished followers created a religion around his teachings. Like most organized religion, over the centuries, there was some divergence between the teachings of the founder and the way the institution operates. So today, most people who consider themselves to be followers of the Buddha's teachings are members of the Buddhist religion. But this religious overlay is optional. The teachings as offered by the Buddha work equally well for those people, those of any religion or of no religion. Most people associate the term Buddhist with the religion, and this can create confusion when dealing with non-religious followers, and that includes IMC Charlotte. We're a non-religious follower of the Buddhist teachings. For me, to avoid confusion, I don't refer to myself as a Buddhist. I don't think of myself as a Buddhist. I think of myself as a dedicated follower of the Buddhist teachings. Now, having said that, I don't want anybody to hear the going off on the Buddhist religion. I think it's important to recognize the crucial role that religious Buddhists, primarily nuns and monks, have had in preserving the historical record. There is no doubt that if they had not devoted their lives to preserving, transcribing, translating, and teaching these teachings, they wouldn't be available for us today. And so there's a high debt of gratitude we have to those people. But still, most scholars agree that as custodians of the historical record, the religious Buddhists also made modifications so that it more closely aligned with the needs of the institution. So, how do we take this imperfect record of the Buddhist teachings and organize our lives and our practice around it? How do we resolve apparent conflicts in the historical record? We haven't chosen, as I said, the easy path. I have had moments when I encountered elements in the Pali Canon that I found very disturbing, and I thought, I don't know if I want to continue on this path. I don't know if what was being taught, if I can align that with my values. And I'm going to offer a few examples along with how I've navigated them. So for me, the first thing that comes to mind is the treatment of women. Now, you won't hear the sutta that I'm going to share with you quoted so often in here for obvious reasons. But in this context, I think it's important to examine it. So initially, the Buddha's order was comprised exclusively of men. And over time, women became interested in the teachings. And eventually one approached the Buddha. It's a longer and interesting story, but approached the Buddha and asked that a female monastic order be permitted. And initially he said, no, we're not doing that. But eventually he consented to it, but he placed certain stipulations on it. There were these 8 capital points or special rules for nuns over and above rules for monks. And just to look at 2 of them, so a female monk is referred to as a bhikkhuni, and a male monk, a female nun, a male is referred to as a bhikkhu. So one of the 2 is a bhikkhuni who has been admitted even 100 years, admitted to the Sangha, must pay homage to, get up for, reverentially salute, and respectfully greet a bhikkhu admitted that day. Here's another one. It is not allowed for bhikkhunis to address discourses to bhikkhus, but it is allowed for bhikkhus to address bhikkhunis. So how's that for an eye-opener? A senior nun with decades of diligent study and practice has to defer to a 20-year-old monk that just ordained that day. No nuns may ever teach monks. So when I first heard this, I found it deeply troubling. How could I have confidence in the teachings of the Buddha when he established such an inequitable structure? On its face, a structure that would increase and not decrease human suffering. Now, over time, I've come to recognize part of my issue here is a central misunderstanding on my part. Having been raised as a Christian, my unrecognized framework for a spiritual teacher was one of being omniscient, that is, all-knowing. But that's not really a part of the story of the Buddha. While he did fully awaken to a penetrating understanding of the nature of existence, the understanding was still housed in the form of a human being. The Theravadan monk Ajahn Sumedho likes to say, the personality never gets enlightened. For me, it was a process of accepting that a fully awakened being could still have flaws in his perception of ordinary day-to-day matters. And it is well documented that the Buddha made decisions that he later rethought and changed his mind about. So it was really my framework that I was insisting he fit into that was the source of that particular disparity. Now, another possibility is that the Buddha saw this inequity clearly, but he concluded it was a necessary evil. Some will offer the explanation that it would have been inconceivable in the social order of his time for him to make female monastics equal to males. And from that point of view, this imperfect compromise allowed for a female order to be established. That was a good thing. It ensured that the Sangha could continue rather than be obliterated. That's a good thing. And the teachings could survive to come down to us. So it is possible that the overall impact was to reduce suffering while not completely eliminated. So in the context of our times, this would be viewed as something that was necessary at the time, but which can now be abandoned. In the simile of the raft, so this is another sutta, the simile of the raft, the Buddha describes a situation where a raft is needed to cross to the far side of a river. After constructing and using the raft, the question arises, what should be done with this object that has served its purpose? The answer is it should not be hoisted onto one's shoulders and carried around indefinitely. Instead, it should be relinquished. And likewise, the social conditions now permit women to be considered equals of men. Therefore, there's no reason to carry on with this practice. So another possibility is the Buddha didn't even issue these restrictions. Over the centuries, as the male-dominated institution of the Buddhist religion negotiated its various challenges, it's possible this material was just inserted. There are certainly many examples of religions making changes to their doctrine as needed to manage the social circumstances. So for me, I don't really require a conclusive answer to this. What I do know is that loving kindness and compassion permeate the Buddhist teachings. Likewise, the wish for all beings to be free from suffering permeates the teachings. And this tells me all that I need to know. I am comfortable relegating this problematic practice to the dustbin of history. So another challenge that we may encounter in following the Buddhist teachings here in our time is the emphasis on vegetarianism. Nuns and monks were prohibited from eating meat which had been killed for food, and even householders or lay people were encouraged to practice non-killing. It is the first of the 5 householder precepts. Now, it was not a simple precept to implement in the Buddhist Sangha. When making their alms rounds, the nuns and the monks relied on the generosity of the villagers for their sustenance. And they were expected to accept what was offered and not negotiate for something different. The Buddha resolved this by instructing that one can eat meat that has been killed without the knowledge or consent of the practitioner, but not if the animal was killed for that purpose with the practitioner's knowledge. So in this way, practitioners never actually created any demand for meat that resulted in slaughter of animals, but it also permitted the flesh of an already slaughtered animal not to go to waste, but to be used for nourishment. Now, in our modern world, I personally can't see many instances where the precept against non-killing of animals for food wouldn't apply. Suffering inflicted on animals by our modern commercial meat production industry far exceeds that during the time of the Buddha. And in addition, our knowledge of nutrition is far superior, and the range of available meat substitutes is much greater. So like all ethical decisions in our lives, this is a personal decision each of us must weigh. The Quakers tell a story of a young William Penn, a soldier who was uncomfortable with war. He asked his friend George Fox, "How long can I continue to wear my sword?" Fox's answer was, "Wear it as long as you can." The message here is that our conscience will function as a guide, and at a certain point, actions which conflict with our values will become so uncomfortable that we will take action to resolve the conflict. That is how I arrived at vegetarianism. If I had to kill an animal to survive, I suspect I would do that. But since I don't have to, I choose not to. It's a very personal decision. Now, the last one I want to touch on is the use of intoxicants. So this is another issue that many of us confront in living the Buddha's path in this day and time. For monastics, the precept is complete abstinence from intoxicants, while for householders, it's a conditional precept with the admonition to avoid using intoxicants that cause negligence or infatuation or heedlessness. In his book, 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness, Theravadan monk Bhante Gunaratna says, "The careful use of pain-killing drugs and other narcotics prescribed by a doctor does not violate the prohibition, nor does occasional light use of alcohol, such as a glass of wine. We must use common sense." He continues, "Though light use of alcohol may be allowed, it is inadvisable. People use intoxicants for many reasons. Young people want to feel more grown up or sophisticated. Shy or nervous people want to relax or feel more sociable. Troubled people want to forget their problems. All these motivations arise from dissatisfaction, from wanting to escape the reality of what is happening in the present moment." So if we're mindful of our actions, we will limit or eliminate the use of alcohol because we see from our own experience the negative consequences. Like the story of William Penn's sword, this is a matter which is, in a sense, self-correcting. I see this in my own life. I have periods when I use alcohol in moderation and periods when I abstain. I'm under no illusion that alcohol moves me forward on this path, but as of now, I have not chosen to completely renounce it. So that's an unresolved matter in my life. When the negative consequences of an action begin to weigh heavily enough, we are moved to bring about change. No one can tell us how to negotiate our relationship with intoxicants. Change imposed from the outside is rarely successful, but it is the change that's motivated by our internal awareness that is sustainable. So in closing, I just want to say, if time permitted, we could explore any number of other topics like this, including same-sex relationships. I think there's much to be said about that. For me, I take encouragement that the central teachings consistently prove themselves to be true in my own experience. These teachings include suffering and the end of suffering. They include the three factors of unreliability, unsatisfactoriness, and selflessness. They include mindfulness and concentration practices. And they include the importance of loving kindness, compassion, empathy, and equanimity. When I stay with these central messages and I make space for the imperfections of the historical record, then these inconsistencies just fall away as unimportant noise. Our companions and our teachers on the path can be a great resource, and as our practice matures, the cultivation of discernment occurs naturally, if not always comfortably. Offer that for your consideration.